The street was quiet when he first moved into his new home. A small house with white walls and a red door. The kind of place he thought would finally bring him peace after years of hard work. He planted flowers in the yard, painted the fence, and smiled each morning when he walked out and saw children playing and neighbors waving. For a short time life felt perfect. But soon shadows crept into his happiness. It started with a letter slipped into his mailbox. A notice from the neighborhood association claiming his grass was too long. He laughed at first, confused because he had cut it just a day before. Still he paid the fine because he thought it was a mistake. But then came another notice, this time about his car parked too close to the sidewalk, and again another about the color of his mailbox not matching the community style. Each fine felt heavier than the last, and when he tried to talk to the association leaders they ignored him or smirked like they enjoyed his frustration. He realized quickly that these were not simple mistakes. They were targeting him, and the leader of the group, a tall man with sharp eyes and a constant smirk, seemed to have made it his personal mission to break him down. Every week new complaints arrived, some absurd like accusing him of hanging clothes outside for too long or keeping lights on too late. And when he tried to argue, the board members only raised their voices, twisting rules he had never even heard of. Neighbors began to whisper, some avoiding his gaze, others laughing quietly when another fine showed up at his door. Slowly the dream of a peaceful home became a nightmare of constant harassment. Yet he endured, cutting the grass twice, repainting the mailbox, parking far away, following every rule more carefully than anyone. But still the notices never stopped. He felt like an enemy in his own neighborhood, and his heart grew heavier with each letter. His nights restless, his mornings filled with dread. As he checked the mailbox, hoping for relief but always finding another punishment. And then the day came when they called a public meeting. He thought maybe finally he would get a chance to explain himself, to tell everyone the truth. But the moment he entered the hall he felt the hostility. The room buzzed with whispers, eyes staring at him with judgment. The board sat at the front like kings ready to deliver their sentence. The leader stood up and began reading a long list of supposed violations, his voice loud and sharp, accusing him of being a bad neighbor, of disrespecting the community, of lowering the value of the street. Each word twisted the truth further, turning small lies into heavy chains. He tried to defend himself, his voice trembling but honest, telling them how he had followed every rule, how he had tried to live in peace. But his words were drowned out by laughter and shouts. The leader banged the table, declaring that enough was enough, and the board members raised their hands one by one in a vote, a cruel show of power, their faces cold as stone. And when the last hand lifted, the verdict was clear. He was to be removed from the neighborhood, forced to leave the house he had worked so hard to own. The crowd erupted, some cheering, others smirking, their voices like knives cutting his dignity. He looked around desperately for even one kind face, one neighbor willing to stand up for him. But all he saw were turned heads and mocking smiles. The walls of the hall seemed to close in on him as the leader leaned forward with his smirk and said the words that burned into his memory. "You don't belong here, pack your things and get out." The humiliation struck him deeper than any wound, his chest heavy, his throat dry. He wanted to scream, to fight, but his body refused. His legs carried him out silently as the laughter followed him like chains dragging behind. Outside the night air was cold, the street lights flickered, and as he walked back to his home he felt like a ghost in a place he had once loved. He sat on his porch staring at the house, the flowers, the fence, everything he had built with love, and tears filled his eyes not from weakness but from anger. An anger that burned beneath the surface like fire waiting to rise. Because while they celebrated his defeat, he knew deep inside this was not the end. This was only the beginning of something far greater. The humiliation had planted a seed of vengeance, and though he walked out quietly that night, carrying only his pain, he made a silent promise that one day he would return, not as the man they kicked out, but as the man they would all bow before, and that thought stayed with him, beating in his chest louder than their laughter, stronger than their vote, and sharper than their lies. He walked into the darkness that night not as a broken man, but as a storm waiting to rise. After the night of humiliation when he was forced to leave his beloved house, he moved into a small rented apartment on the edge of town, a place far from the wide streets and polished lawns of the neighborhood that had rejected him. The walls were thin, the ceiling leaked when it rained, and the sound of traffic outside never stopped. He felt like a man exiled from his own dream, carrying nothing but boxes of memories and the sting of betrayal. Each morning he woke early out of habit, putting on the same neat clothes. But instead of stepping onto his porch, he now sat at a cracked table. Staring at unpaid bills and the echo of silence, his neighbors in the new place hardly noticed him. Some even whispered when they heard the story about how he was kicked out. Because news of his humiliation traveled fast, twisted by the same arrogant board members who enjoyed painting him as the problem. Yet deep inside he refused to believe their version would be the ending of his story. He would walk past his old street sometimes, standing far away to watch, and from a distance he saw the same board leader boasting with neighbors, smirking as if he had won some grand battle, children playing without knowing the cruelty behind the fences, families sipping coffee on porches while gossiping about him. And each time he clenched his fists tighter, promising himself that one day those smiles would fade. In his small apartment he studied every rulebook, every public document tied to the neighborhood. He discovered loopholes, debts, and secret lawsuits buried deep. The board had covered up scandals, stolen money from maintenance funds, and even lied about property values to keep power in their hands. The deeper he dug, the more their image of perfection cracked. But while he uncovered their dirt, he still faced his own struggle. The rent was high, his savings were shrinking, and sometimes he skipped meals to stretch his money. Nights were long, filled with restless thoughts of revenge mixed with the fear that maybe he had lost everything forever. Yet each time he looked at the papers filled with the board's corruption, the fear turned into fuel. He began working extra shifts at a warehouse, his hands blistered and back aching. Yet every extra coin he earned he saved carefully, not for comfort but for something bigger. He avoided parties, ignored distractions, and kept his life small, because he was building something no one could see. And when loneliness pressed hard, he reminded himself of that meeting, of the laughter that followed him out the door, and it lit a fire that refused to go out. His struggle outside the neighborhood became his training ground, sharpening his patience, teaching him discipline, and preparing him for a storm greater than anyone expected. While the board thought he was broken, he was becoming something. Stronger in silence, a shadow waiting to strike, and though the world saw only a man living in a cheap apartment struggling to survive, the truth was that every day he was taking one step closer to reclaiming not just his house but the entire block, and the struggle that nearly crushed him was quietly forging him into the weapon that would destroy them. The struggle outside slowly turned into determination. He knew living in that small apartment was not forever. It was only a step in a journey that no one else could see. While the board members and arrogant neighbors relaxed thinking they had destroyed him, he was quietly drawing a map of revenge. Each night under the dim light of his rented room he studied property records, tax reports, and market values, and to his surprise he found cracks everywhere. Many houses on the block were under heavy mortgages. Some families were desperate to sell, but the board kept controlling the process to benefit themselves, and others had disputes with the HOA that were quietly being buried. He saw opportunity where no one else was looking. At first he bought a small piece of land near the neighborhood using the savings he had scraped together from endless shifts. No one cared. They thought it was nothing. But for him it was the first brick in a wall that would surround them. He worked with silent partners, old friends who trusted him and small investors who believed in his vision. Through them he disguised his purchases, buying houses one by one as they came up for sale, some through auctions, others through secret deals where desperate owners needed cash quickly. And each time he signed papers his heart burned with satisfaction. Because those same neighbors who once voted to push him out were unknowingly handing their homes to him. The board leader laughed in public meetings about how weak he was, never realizing that behind the scenes his power was slipping away, slowly but surely. He built his empire in silence. His days were filled with normal routines, working shifts, smiling politely. But his nights were filled with plans, phone calls, and contracts. The walls of his apartment were covered with papers, maps of the block with red marks on every house he had bought. And as the months passed, more and more red filled the page until the neighborhood looked like it was bleeding. Sometimes he would drive by the houses he owned, watching families mow the lawn or hang decorations, and he would smile because they had no idea the man they once mocked was now their landlord. His hidden plan grew sharper when he realized the board itself was in debt. Using community funds to cover their personal luxuries, he found proof of their corruption and kept it locked away, waiting for the right time. Every insult they once threw at him only made him more patient. Every memory of humiliation made him more careful. He never rushed, never revealed his hand, because he knew revenge was sweetest when it arrived as a shock. His secret collection of deeds and contracts grew thicker until one day he realized he no longer just had pieces. He controlled the heart of the block, The homes, the land, the streets, everything they thought was theirs was already his, and while they laughed louder at public gatherings, he smiled quietly, because the trap was already built and soon it would close around them, leaving them with nothing, and his hidden plan, born from pain, was now a storm waiting to explode into their world. The day of the neighborhood's big annual meeting arrived, the same kind of meeting where once he had been mocked and humiliated, the same hall where neighbors had laughed while the board voted to throw him out. But this time the air was different. This time the hall was packed with uneasy chatter, because the HOA was drowning in debt, services were failing, lawns were uncut, repairs were ignored, and whispers of corruption had started to spread. Yet the arrogant board leader still stood, tall at the front, smirking and acting like a king in his castle, banging the gavel and calling the meeting to order, boasting about control, promising things he could no longer deliver. The crowd listened half-heartedly, some angry, some bored, when suddenly the doors opened with a heavy echo, and in walked the man they thought they had erased forever, dressed sharp, calm, his eyes cold as stone. Every whisper in the room died, every face turned pale, and silence gripped the hall. The board leader froze for a moment, then forced a fake smile, mocking him loudly. "What are you doing here? You don't even belong in this neighborhood anymore." But the calm man did not answer right away. Instead he walked slowly to the center of the hall, placed a thick folder on the table, and opened it in front of everyone. Inside were deeds, contracts, and ownership papers, one after another laid out with precision. The crowd leaned forward, whispers rising again as they began to understand. He looked up, his voice steady but sharp. "You thought you pushed me out. But while you laughed I was buying everything around you. One house, one lot, one property at a time, and now this neighborhood belongs to me." Gasps filled the room. Neighbors turned to each other in shock, some stood with mouths open, and the board members fumbled nervously, their faces drained of color. The leader slammed his hand on the table, shouting that it was impossible, a trick, but the documents were real, stamped, and signed, undeniable proof of his control. And then came the moment that broke the hall into chaos. He pulled out the final paper, the one that proved he now owned the very house of the board leader himself. The man who once ordered him to leave now unknowingly lived under his ownership. The leader's face went red with rage and fear as laughter broke out among the crowd. But this time it was not at the quiet man standing in the middle. It was at the fallen tyrant whose power had just shattered. The calm man stood taller than ever, his eyes sweeping the room, locking on the faces of those who had cheered when he was thrown out, now watching in silence, ashamed and afraid, and he spoke again, his words heavy with the weight of revenge. "The night you humiliated me I made a promise, that one day I would return not to beg but to own everything you tried to take from me, and today I keep that promise." The hall erupted, some cheering, some shouting. Neighbors realizing their lives had changed in an instant. The balance of power had flipped completely. The board leader trembled, stuttering with anger, but no one listened to him anymore. All eyes were on the man who had once been an outcast, now revealed as the master of the block, and the shocking return was complete. A moment so powerful it burned into everyone's memory, for they knew nothing would ever be the same again. The hall was still shaking with shock when he closed the folder and looked around at the crowd. The same people who once mocked him now sat in silence, eyes wide, some biting their lips, some hiding their faces, and he could feel the weight of their fear pressing against him like the wind before a storm. The board leader tried to regain control, shouting angrily that the meeting was not over, that no one could take his power, but his voice cracked and shook, no longer carrying the arrogance it once did, and the calm man simply raised his hand and said firmly, "Your time is over." Then he reached into the folder again and pulled out not just the ownership papers but also copies of hidden records, documents that showed years of corruption, stolen money, false fines, and secret accounts. Every dirty secret the board had tried to bury was now in his hands, and he laid them out one by one on the table for everyone to see. The neighbors gasped as they recognized their own money in those numbers. Fees they had paid for repairs that were never done. Fines they had been forced to hand over for rules that were never real. All of it stolen. All of it exposed. The crowd began to murmur angrily, their eyes turning on the board members who sat frozen like statues, pale and sweating. The board leader shouted that it was lies, forged papers, but no one believed him anymore, not when the evidence was so clear and his fear so visible. Then the calm man raised his voice again, louder this time, steady and commanding. These people thought they could humiliate me, rob you, and treat you like their slaves. But now their reign is finished. Today they are removed. Cheers burst out from the crowd, claps and shouts echoing through the hall as he turned to the guards at the door. The same guards who once stood silently when he was thrown out, and ordered them to escort the corrupt board members out of the hall. The guards obeyed without hesitation, dragging the leader and his allies through the aisle as neighbors jeered and shouted at them, some even throwing papers and insults. The once untouchable tyrants now reduced to trembling figures, begging to be heard, but no one cared. The revenge was too sweet. The balance of power too completely destroyed, and as they were dragged away, he stood at the front of the hall, no longer the victim but the ruler, and announced new rules, fair rules, ending the cruel fines, returning stolen money, and promising that the neighborhood would never again be controlled by greedy hands. The people cheered louder, their voices shaking the ceiling, and for the first time in months they looked at him, not with pity or mockery but with respect and gratitude, their faces glowing with relief. And as he looked at the crowd he remembered the night he walked out broken, the sound of their laughter stabbing at him, and now to stand here, watching the same mouths shouting his name in support, filled him with a satisfaction so deep it was almost unreal. But he did not smile arrogantly, his face remained calm, his eyes sharp, because he knew revenge was not just about exposing them, it was about making them feel the humiliation he once felt, and tonight he had achieved exactly that. The corrupt board leader would never again smirk at him. The arrogant members would never again mock him. Their power was gone, their names ruined, their respect shattered, and the sweet taste of justice spread through every corner of the hall, every clap and cheer echoing like thunder, declaring that the man they tried to erase had now erased them instead. And though he stood silently, inside his heart roared with triumph, because revenge had finally been served. The corrupt board members were gone, their voices silenced, their pride crushed, and their names stained forever. But his journey did not end with their downfall. It was only completed when he rebuilt everything they had destroyed. In the weeks after his shocking return he took full control of the neighborhood, walking the same streets where once people had whispered against him. But now every door opened to greet him, every neighbor looked at him with respect. The houses that once stood like walls against him now felt like pillars supporting his victory. He began by canceling every unfair fine, tearing up the false notices that had been used to humiliate him, handing back money to families who had been robbed, and promising that never again would rules be used as weapons. He hired honest people to manage the community, fixing broken lights, repairing sidewalks, planting new trees, and soon the neighborhood that had once been poisoned by greed began to breathe fresh life. Children laughed freely again, families felt safe, and the block shined brighter than ever, and all of it stood under his name. Because he owned it now, every house, every street, every corner was his. The same neighbors who had once cheered when he was forced out now lowered their heads when they passed him. Ashamed of their silence, some came to him with tears, asking for forgiveness. And though he did not forget their cruelty, he gave them peace, because his victory was bigger than their regret. It was not about punishing the weak but about destroying the corrupt. He stood one evening at the very center of the block, looking at the houses glowing with warm lights, hearing the sound of families enjoying a peace they had never known under the old board, and he felt a deep calm. He had turned his humiliation into triumph, his pain into power, and his exile into an empire. Yet the memory of that night in the meeting hall when they mocked him never faded. It stayed like a scar, reminding him always of what he had endured. But instead of bitterness it gave him strength, a constant fire to protect what he had built. He walked back to his old house, the same one he had been thrown out of, only now it was his again. Not just his but surrounded by every home that also belonged to him. And he stood on the porch where he once sat broken, this time standing tall. The laughter of that night replaced by the sound of respect. And, with a faint smile, he whispered to himself that he had won. Not just by taking back his place but by taking everything they thought they controlled. The neighborhood was his kingdom now, and no one could take it away. His victory was final, complete, and unshakable. And though the people around him celebrated their freedom, deep inside he celebrated something even greater. The promise he had made to himself on the night of his humiliation was fulfilled. He had returned, he had conquered, and he had turned their attempt to erase him into the very reason his name would never be forgotten. And with that he walked back into his home, not as a victim but as the master of the block, a man who had faced the storm and become the storm, And his story ended not with defeat but with victory so powerful that it echoed in every brick, every street, and every whisper of the neighborhood he now owned completely.